And we are live. Alright, let me get back to you so I can see your lovely, lovely face. So yeah, we are back at it again.
We are back at it again, episode number 2 of Hey, Listen to This. That's Ryan Kearns, I'm Matt Durzik, and today we're just going to sort of pull things back a little bit and just sort of talk about what made us love music so much. And our journeys, I feel, are going to be fairly different because, well, we listen to fairly different music.
Yeah, I don't know, I think due to my years of being a retail manager, the classic thing they talk to us about is, diversity in terms of, diversity. But realistically, both me and Matt, while we might look the same in terms of that we're both white men in America,
I'm curious to where you're going with this, but keep going.
My path, when it comes to, exploring music and all the genres that have caught my eye and, my life that I've lived is vastly different to Matt's. So, I mean, while we might have some overlapping stuff, we definitely, I feel like this episode is going to be quintessential for any other future episodes that are going to be happening here in the near future, for you guys to understand, where I look at it when it comes to, what I value in music and what Matt values in music.
Yeah. So, how do you want to start? Do you want to start, from the very beginning? What was the first time you thought to yourself, hey, this is music, I like it?
Let me quote a poet, okay? This was the first music I ever heard, and I'm like, man, I really, really like this thing. What is this thing called? Alright? I hope you are ready for this. Let me pull up the lyrics. Alright, so, somebody once told me, the world is gonna roll me. I ain't the sharpest tool in the shed. Do I need to go on?
No, I think that does it for this episode of Hey, Listen to This. We thank you all for listening. Really, that was the first one.
Yeah, yep. That was the very first song that registered in my brain of oh, wow, I actually like this. What is this thing called?
I don't know what it was for me particularly. I just sort of know there was a time when I was a kid when obviously there was, growing up as a kid, you had sort of your kids sing along stuff. I remember something along the lines of kid songs I was really into when I was a kid, whether it was, do you know what kid songs is by chance?
I can only imagine. I mean, I might just make it up in my head.
Okay, basically it were these productions that were a half hour long, and they just sort of had certain themes, and they would mix original songs with pop hits. One was about sports. They had a little Beach Boys in there. One was about careers. One was about playing on the farm, and it was kind of cool and cute. And I think that was one of the first early remembrances I have of thinking, oh, music, cool. And then on top of that, there was some other sing-along stuff I knew as a kid. I didn't really get into the Disney stuff too much until maybe a couple years into my childhood. I know a lot of kids raised on Disney, especially nowadays.
Man.
So, you have your kids that are growing up on the likes of Let It Go and, We Don't Talk About Bruno, stuff like that.
Oh, man. Just think about, what some people are brought up on, so, I talk about, Smash Mouth. For those of you who were not aware about the first song that, entered my consciousness as music, that was, the song All Star by a group named, Smash Mouth. Yeah, so think about, the music that I was, I don't want to say, well, I'll say for lack of a better term, raised on, the first wave of music that just hit me So from Smash Mouth, I got introduced to a band called the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Their album Californication came out, and that was like my first, like, hey, this is the first CD that I ever owned, and I played it to death. And I will always have a special spot for the band, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, in my life, even though they are often a meme. Let's be real. But and then even outside of that, I was a kid in the 90s, and, well, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was this thing called nu metal that, caught my eye in terms of, like, bands like Korn, Disturbed, Limp Bizkit. And I think those were the big acts that I can think of. Also had some Marilyn Manson in there too. So thinking about like how some kids are being brought up on like, we don't talk about Bruno, no. And lo and behold, like, decades earlier, I was being brought up by Fred Durst being like, alright, you know what time it is, baby. Keep on rolling. It's just drastically different, but like, I think during, up until, I would say maybe, late elementary school or early middle school, favorite bands that I had through that time was, obviously you kind of picked up on it, the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I eventually grew into having Simple Plan being one of my favorite bands of all time. It's so sad of how far the mighty have fallen. So those were like, that era of my life, those were the quintessential artists.
So, going back a little bit for me, I would probably say when I was young, I talked about the kids stuff. I also listened to a lot of country music because at the time my dad, who used to be a drummer, and he would play in all these different bands. Well, in the 90s, he was playing for country bands. He played for bands like Broken Pick, Dakota, The Undecided, kind of local bands. Not anything there's like, oh, I have that album. They didn't do anything like that. But, he was playing country, so we listened to a lot of country, and we used to listen to a station called K105 that was out of Youngstown, 88,000 watts. You could probably hear it from your house, even though you live in Pittsburgh. And this was 90s country, so of course Garth was like all the rage. Tim McGraw was coming into his own with his first few hits. Toby Keith, even older artists like Patty Loveless, Reba McEntire. They were definitely part of my upbringing, listening to those songs on the radio. So country music sort of holds a small, a good place in my heart. Because I was raised on that. And it was what I would listen to Sunday mornings on the way to church and stuff like that. And then, at the same time, a few years down the line, it kind of goes in a couple directions. Because whenever you're going into school, and particularly a school like a public school, you tend to start, hanging out with other people because you have classmates and you start talking with them. And so some of them might start listening to what's popular, So whatever's on the charts, as they say. And for me particularly, sort of skipping ahead a little bit, when I was in middle school, did you guys ever do dances in middle school, or like sort of like parties for like good grades or attendance or whatever the hell?
Oh yeah. We did that, man. I don't think we ever did it for like good grades or like attendance, which is an interesting concept now that I'm thinking about it. But like, no, we had dances in middle school and like that stuff.
Yeah. I think when I was in middle school, I think they had like a winter dance, a spring dance, a good grades dance. I forget what the actual order was, but you would go to these dances or these parties, and that's where you would have like a DJ and they'd be playing, the good stuff, you know, and me being in middle school around 2003, 2004, you know, you go from being a goody two-shoes and, you know, trying to get all A's and ending up with like a 3.5, you know, being a good kid in class, and all of a sudden your reward is listening to Lil Jon, the East Side Boys.
Oh, no.
Or Usher, or Sierra, or whoever else was coming out at the time. Because that was really a shift from, you know, when rock was sort of dying out of the mainstream as a commercial force. Not in a complete sense, but definitely in a singles sense. Like, the only, like, singles bands you had, like, you mentioned Red Hot Chili Peppers, Nickelback got in there every once in a while. Green Day had, like, a big surge around that time. Hoobastank, throw them in there. But yeah, it was not really that much on the charts in that regard, especially not compared to the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, whatever.
Yeah.
But speaking of...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, speaking of rock, sort of dialing it back a few years, the other path it kind of took was one of the first albums I remember listening to ad nauseum on repeat. Really wasn't an album per se, but a greatest hits album. And it was the album One by the Beatles. So whenever I want to say it was 2001 or 2000, whatever it first came out, and we spent a weekend up at my grandparents' place in New York City. They lived in Manhattan. And I just remember, like, listening to that album nonstop with my brother just over and over and over again. So that's when the Beatles became, like, a huge influence for me. Now, again, those were all just the hits. I still had to get into the stuff like, you know, the back end of Revolver, or Sgt. Pepper, or the White Album.
Number 9?
Just, you know, 8 minutes of noise, and you just... a bunch of people at the end going, block that kick! Block that kick! And I'm thinking, this is rock? This is a rock album? What's going on here?
Yeah. Fun fact. I'll you know, go in reverse in terms of, like, my trajectory, because, like, you know, ironically enough, like, I feel like this point of our lives, this is where our majority of our musical upbringing has, like, overlapped. And that's because, unfortunately, we were kids growing up through, like, the 9/11 era, and country music was so huge during that time, and I mean, rightfully so. But I want to talk about the Beatles here real quick. So, what was your first compilation album that you listened to or, like, owned by the Beatles?
Well, that I personally owned? That's a little bit of a loaded question, and I'll explain why. So, going back to my dad, he actually owned the original U.S. Albums on vinyl. So that's kind of how I started listening to Beatles records that way. Now, as which one was the first one I remember listening to? I don't know. I want to say it was Sgt. Pepper, but I don't think it was. I know it definitely wasn't the White Album. I want to say it was either Meet the Beatles or maybe Let It Be. Either of the bookends that I remember listening to.
Yeah. My first one that I ever picked up, like, I remember going to, ironically enough, a Rite Aid, where I used to, like, go into, like, different retail stores. I'm like, hey, I want to buy a CD. Crazy times, right? So I saw that they had a Beatles CD available. I'm like, the Beatles, they are a good band. I should buy this CD. So that album turned out to be Revolver. So that was the very first Beatles album I ever heard, start to finish.
Now, I have two questions for you in that regard.
Uh-huh.
Number one, and this is more of a rhetorical question, so you don't have to answer. How the hell did you get a copy of Revolver at Rite Aid? What year was this?
I don't remember. Keep in mind, it was just a CD, so it wasn't like...
I understand that. I mean, if they sold vinyl, my mind would have been blown completely, but no, I knew it would have been in CD, but still, I just... The idea of selling a Beatles CD at Rite Aid, just, it seems like a foreign concept nowadays. I mean, selling CDs anywhere is a foreign concept.
I feel like we might have gotten our episode title there.
There you go. But secondly, was it the... I take it was the 14-track version that you got?
I do not remember. You're giving me way too much credit. Let me...
Did it have Andrew... Let me ask you this. Did it have Andrew Bird Can Sing on there?
Yes.
Okay, then it was the 14-track. Because, again, going back to the vinyl that my dad had, he had all the U.S. albums, and up until, I think, Sgt. Pepper, they were all different for some stupid reason. So the UK and the US releases were different. So the American version of Revolver only has, I think, 11 songs on it. And Your Bird Can Sing, I do not believe is one of them.
But thinking about, like, you know, the song And Your Bird Can Sing by the Beatles, what a good song, man. What a good song. So, like, retracting, and so I can catch up with Matt in terms of, like, my linear progression in terms of, like, you know, my life's journey through music. So last left off with me being like a Simple Plan fan and like, just being a kid of the TRL era where like, new metal and like, anything pop punk caught my eye. And then, unfortunately 9/11 happened and, I feel like the country as a whole, there might have been like, some pockets of like, just the America as it is known as that didn't care for country music, but like this is where like you get your artists like Toby Keith, Alan Jackson, just those artists that really rose to prominence to really capture the zeitgeist of the era. And my stepdad, he was also a country fan because he was brought up on Johnny Cash. So, I moved in with my stepdad around like 2000. So about a year later is when all this, country, influence really started to take shape. So that lasted for a couple of years. And then, around like maybe like 2003, 2004, that's when I really started to veer into like, more of the mainstream of the generation of the time in terms of like getting the traditional like pop music into my life, like Black Eyed Peas, Usher, and then even veering off into like off into left field with like exploring more of my like I would want to say like harsher tones in my listening preferences. So this is when I got introduced to like My Chemical Romance, Green Day. My first My Chem CD that I ever owned was 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, and the first Green Day album I ever owned was American Idiot. And that's pretty much that catches us up to this point. By this point, still, I was without like a definitive favorite artist. That wouldn't happen until like the high school years of Ryan Kearns.
Yeah. Well, I do want to sidetrack a little bit. We'll get back to where we are about like mid 2000s as we transition out of middle school into high school. But you mentioned the whole 9/11 thing and how country influence sort of starts coming at this time. And you were saying how a lot of these artists like Alan Jackson and Toby Keith didn't really, come to prominence until that time. I would actually disagree with that, at least from a, commercial standpoint, because I think, obviously those two guys, in particular, Toby Keith and Alan Jackson, they had their big 9/11 type songs. But what 9/11 did for country music was sort of shift it back into that mode that you were talking about, like, your dad liked Johnny Cash, and it was a lot, sort of a tougher country, a bit more of a manly man's type country, talk about God and gun and Jesus and the flag. And not that songs in the 90s didn't do that, but they didn't do that. The country in the 90s, it was very good, but it was definitely more of a sort of a crossbreed between, I don't know, like adult contemporary, sort of a jangly college rock and country music. And I love 90s country. But is it the kind that you would want to blast from a giant pickup truck with bare arms, proving to the world that you bear arms? Not necessarily. So when 9/11 happened, people became more patriotic. I think it sort of fueled that more woodsy, rootsy type of attitude that really kind of does linger in country music, even if the sort of gruffness has deteriorated.
Yeah. I can definitely get behind that. So, anyways, up until this point, it seems like we had, like, a different, like, at least introduction to music, and then from, like, the similar kind of era, like, our tastes would have overlapped. I think the only difference is, like, I kind of got into bands like My Chemical Romance at the time. Were you ever into that music during that 2004?
Not too heavily. Like, I knew of My Chemical Romance, and I did appreciate Green Day for what they were doing, but I did not own any of the albums. I did not listen to the likes of Hawthorne Heights. My focus was very much still on mainstream music, classic rock, and oldies. And sort of putting a spoiler in there, that's how it would pretty much be up until, honestly, college, really.
Okay.
Because during high school, like, there were a few artists that I started listening to, and my penchant for classic rock. I started reading a lot more Rolling Stone back when it was feasibly okay to do that. And I, would sort of dig more into, like, other classic rock. Like, I know I started getting interested in, like, the Velvet Underground, listen to a little bit more, like, R&B. But ultimately, the same parameters of listening to X, Y, and Z as I had didn't really change until I got to college.
So, you talk about, in high school and everything like that, you were kind of did a deeper dive into that classic rock realm. I had a very similar path. I remember specifically through high school, there was a couple of band kids that were there that were really into this little known band called Led Zeppelin. They thought every other band that wasn't Led Zeppelin was Led Zeppelin, but with distortion. So, went through my classic rock phase there. But I wouldn't really identify any of the bands that came out of that exploration into the past as, like, a favorite band of mine. It was during this time that I was introduced to two foundational bands that were also part of my musical upbringing. One being the White Stripes, and two being what I would consider to be my next favorite band, the Foo Fighters. The very first song that I heard from the Foo Fighters is a song called The Pretender. And I remember specifically watching that music video, and I'm like, dude, this band is so cool, so awesome. And around that time, maybe junior or senior year of high school is when I went to go see them live for the very first time. They were my first concert. So, yeah, they were a huge part of my high school musical taste. Along with that, maybe junior or senior year of high school, I remember specifically buying a copy of the Rolling Stone magazine and reading an article an album review of a band called My Morning Jacket, and it's for their album Evil Urges, and they gave it 4 stars out of 5. And thinking about how foundational that moment was for what was to come in my life, and how I really expanded my musical taste, is crazy to think about how, like, a little known magazine called Rolling Stone and a album that had a song lyric talking about peanut butter surprises really opened the floodgates for what was to come with Ryan Kearns and his musical exploration. But, like, so yeah, I think that does encapsulate everything up until after high school for me.
Just piggybacking off that a little bit, with the Rolling Stone stuff, like you mentioned My Morning Jacket, and I didn't listen to the album, still haven't listened to the album, but I will admit that I'm Amazed is a phenomenal track that I really need to take another listen to because, so good. And as far as some other bands at that time, I know TV on the Radio, I remember they gave a lot of high praise to, and I was like, oh, I'll check them out. And then, again, listened to the one song and thought it was pretty good. But again, a lot of the stuff that I listened to was mostly just classic rock, pop, and, I would say pop was like a very little here and there. It was mostly classic rock and oldies at that point. And then in 2011, late 2010, early 2011, I heard 2 albums that really sort of changed my, views on music as far as like full albums and everything. One of them was Kanye West with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. And then later on, Arcade Fire with The Suburbs. And those 2 albums were like the first major album where, they were full productions and they sort of had this flow that I really hadn't heard in an album since the likes of either Sgt. Pepper or even Todd Rundgren's A Wizard, A True Star. They had this flow, and they were all sort of a complete package. They had everything all tied to your theme, and it really sort of shifted my mindset further towards albums, but also towards newer artists making these albums.
Yeah. How far have the mighty have fallen when it comes to Mr. Kanye West? So, again, like, when Kanye came out with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, again, that was an album that came across my spectrum. So, Matt already elaborated on that, so I'm not going to really touch upon that. So, let's see. From after high school, and then I would say probably at least beginning of college, really kind of did more of a deeper dive into the traditional indie scene, alternative stuff. I know a band, another touchstone favorite band of mine was a band called Incubus. Really was super grateful that I was able to see them live, when I was in college, but I forget what was the song that really got me into them. I just, did a random dive into, I think, their album Morning View, and really, really, really did appreciate everything that band had to offer. And I think from here on out, there was an interview that Brandon Boyd did, the lead singer of Incubus, where he was talking about music that he was really drawn to, and his statement really impacted how I viewed music, at least especially going forward. It's this concept of just being very authentic and not telling a lie within their own song. So from there, it was more of an exploration of just again the musical floodgates open for me. So bands like the Mars Volta, Hives, I can name countless amount of artists that came across my spectrum. Their acting tours, The Dead Weather. I know I'm naming primarily Jack White artists, but what have you. The Black Keys came across my radar around this time, with their album Brothers, which is such a, chef's kiss album. Maybe one day me and Matt can talk about that album. And then I will say around this time, the band The Killers came across my radar. Not with Hot Fuss, but more Sam's Town. Side note, I kind of did a quick drive-by with Sam's Town after our last episode, and yeah, it's not the best album. Hot Fuss is their best album. But yeah, skipping ahead a little bit, to college Ryan up until graduation. This is where, I kind of did a more of a deeper dive into the craziness of music that can offer. And there was a internet, YouTuber by the name of Anthony Fantano that I got introduced to that opened up even more floodgates for me. So everything was starting to pour out. So I got into bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor, Cloud Nothings. Cage the Elephant wasn't really a band that he broke for me, but I around that time I got into them. Death Grips was definitely a touchstone for him, for everybody. Kendrick Lamar. I can name so many artists that I got exposed to in college, but I would say the main artists that meant a lot to me during this time, Kendrick Lamar with his album Good Kid, Mad City, one of the first huge touchstone albums that have helped shape my musical taste. The way, if you've not heard of that, if you're not listening to that album whatsoever, it's essentially, the way I can quickly boil it down, it's essentially a concept album, but the way that it's told, it's essentially you're experiencing a motion picture through the eyes of Kendrick Lamar, what it's like to grow up in through a traditional urban environment where this is what kids typically go through, their thoughts and feelings. So if you've not taken the time, if by some chance you've gotten to this episode, you've not heard Good Kid, Mad City as a musical fan, do yourself a favor and check that out now. But yeah, I can touch upon a couple more albums, but I feel that's gonna get towards the later end of where I'm at right now with music, because from what everyone can tell, how much I'm talking, the floodgates were just essentially drowning with me, from every musical thing I can touch my hand.
Yeah, I hear you. And also it should be mentioned that at the same time I was in college and learning about some of these new artists and albums, that we were in college with college students, and one of those students that I happened to run to was you, and that sort of fueled my transformation into learning about new albums, as far as bands I'd never heard of. Also, there was it was 2012 or 11, and the hipster movement was growing. Plenty of fedoras and long beards and flannel, and vinyl was making a comeback, and Fleet Foxes was a thing, and Bon Iver was a thing, and all of which, deservedly so, not to knock any of those. But the changes that I went through around that time, some of the albums I remember really sticking out to me around that time, I already mentioned My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, I already mentioned The Suburbs by Arcade Fire, Reflector by Arcade Fire a little later on down the line, The Second Law by Muse, Some Nights by Fun. I'm trying to think what else was in there. Brothers by the Black Keys you mentioned, I was a fan of that album as well. I'll have to re-listen to that album again at some point soon. the difference in music over that 4-year period, whether it be, and I think it also was my introduction to sort of smaller acts, because when I was in high school, going back just briefly, I got into, I never really hardcore metal or screamo or anything like that, but I did have friends that were. And as that transitioned into college, I started going to see a little bit more live shows, because when you're at Geneva, that was kind of the cool thing to do. So, we had our house band in the Ocean Walker, and other bands that came through, like, I almost said Faith No More. I don't know why I said that. What was their names? The one that sort of preceded the Ocean Walker. I can't remember. Anyways, I was just going to say, with all the different influences that came through, with the hipster movement and all the live bands in Geneva, and again, you for being the influence that you are through our Music Talk 101 days, I started to sort of expand my musical knowledge a little bit at that time.
Yeah. You talk about, different bands that were, blown up through that time. Distinctly remember being introduced to Sanford and Sons. I mean Mumford and Sons. And then also being introduced to bands like Fleet Foxes, Bon Iver. Bands that I got into personally at the time were Japandroids. I know for 1 year when we did our year-end list, Celebration Rock was my favorite album of the year. I think it was for maybe 2011, 2010. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But, and then around that time for myself, this is when my music taste started to, go into its, I don't want to say its final form, because who knows, maybe several years from now I could be into dubstep, Scottish folk funk. But
what a combo.
I was introduced to bands in college. Those bands being Me Without You, Touche Amore, and La Dispute. And when it comes to quintessential albums, specifically from those later two bands, and more specifically from La Dispute, which is my nowadays current favorite band, they have a album out called Wildlife, and maybe we can do a future episode on this album. I'm not sure if you would ever be up for listening to a post-hardcore emo screamo band. But you've been to a lot of Dispute concerts with me, so you know what they have to bring to the table.
I think I've only been to the one that I can recall. I think it was the one that was at the what was it? Was it at the? It wasn't the Roxy-in.
It was the Roxy-in before the Roxy-in.
The one that was in the South Side.
Yeah, I know which one you're talking about.
The Rex. That's what it was, the Rex.
Yeah, there you go.
The Rex, the Rocks, But yeah, I think that was the only La Dispute show I went to. And I remember, even for as loud as it was, I appreciated what it was. It was pretty good.
Yeah. The one thing that I will point out in La Dispute, specifically that album, there's so much I can deep dive into that album. It is so freaking rich. The main reason why it is my favorite album of all time is that it tells so many different stories about just human suffering and what the human condition can really go through, and it's really you can sink your teeth into it so much. One specific moment I remember is when I was I was at home one night in the middle of, as one did, playing Xbox, while listening to loud music, in a completely dark room. They have a song, they being La Dispute, the song's called King Park, and I will always remember this moment until the day that I die. The floor drops out of this song, and the lead singer is talking about, hey, can I still get into heaven if I kill myself? Can I still get into heaven if I kill myself? And the whole, the whole song is about a drive-by shooting gone wrong. Instead of the intended target, a kid got killed, and the shooter, got essentially sequestered himself into a hotel room, and then, the climax of the song, basically tells, how the shooter got spotted, the police swarmed the area, and his uncle was pleading through the door saying, hey, heaven can forgive you, and the shooter in the song is talking about, killing himself, but he wants to know if he can still get into heaven if he does such an act. But even an incredibly nerdy thing about this album, and this will be the last thing I talk about this album until we do a future episode on it. So let me see here. The first song is called A Departure, and the really cool thing about this album is they have spoken word introductions to certain sections of the album, and the first song is called A Departure, which introduces the whole album. So let's see. At the very end, the lyric goes, first a feeling of abandonment, then trying to cope, then death and hope and the thing itself. And those basically entail song themes throughout the rest of the album. So the first section's all about abandonment, next section's all about coping, and then the final sections are death and hope and just life itself. It's such a chef's kiss album, and I was hoping I was really introduced to it any sooner, but yeah. I mean, I can go on about Touche Amore and Is Survived By, and how it was my album of the year for 2012, 2013. But if I had to platform myself up, a quintessential, Ryan Kern's album is Wildlife by Law Dispute.
Well then, that's impressive. We will have to do an episode about that down the line, because I know how much it has an influence on you. For me, I think once I got out of college, I kind of retreated a little bit back to I got back into country music a whole lot more. And just went to my comforts for a while. But every once in a while, and the one album I'll mention out of this is, well, actually I'll mention a couple. I'll mention a couple, which, again, I thank you for, because you talk about the depth of music. I think that's going to be one thing we discover a lot through this podcast. I'm going to end up discovering a lot of music, and I think we're both going to try to expand our taste a little bit. I know I'm going to try, at least. But the two albums that I have really come to love that are sort of outside my comfort zone are Igor by Tyler, the Creator. And also, and also from last year, Dragon, New War Mountain, I Believe in You by Big Thief. Those albums, you get them, chef's kiss. Front to back, fantastic stuff. And but I think from here on out, it's going to be a matter of maybe using this as sort of a next step to figure out what we're into, as far as, maybe what we've listened to all along might sound similar, or maybe there's some undiscovered gems we haven't listened to yet.
Okay. To wrap up, albums that, have been quintessential cornerstone, introductions to, different things for me. And at least, bands and artists, just so everyone can get a full picture of what Ryan Kearns is right now. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention the band Manchester Orchestra. I got introduced to them, maybe, pre-college days. Their album Means Everything to Nothing, it's a really good album. If you wanted to check out that album, key song is I Could Feel a Hot One, and then Shake It Out. And then even fast forwarding to now, like maybe like post-college albums that I got introduced to and artists. Specifically, I'll mention two. Cardinal is the album. Pine Grove is the band. So, have you heard of this artist before, Matt?
Which artist was that again?
Pine Grove.
You might have mentioned them to me once, but I don't remember them.
With somebody with a country upbringing, like I feel like you can really sink your teeth into them.
Okay.
And then another band is the Hotelier, and their album Home Like No Place Hold on, I might be butchering that album title. I am completely, willfully unprepared, and I'm pretty, okay with that. For those of you who are like, yeah, I know which album you're talking about, the album is Home Like No Place Is There. Ironically enough, I saw the Hotelier opening up for La Dispute the first time I ever saw them, La Dispute perform, and I never knew how much that album and that band would impact me. Ironically, only that album has really stuck with me. The Hotelier has, released other albums since then. But Cardinal by Pine Grove and the Hotelier's Home Like No Place Is There, no skips. I can listen to those albums as complete packages. And even nowadays, artists like Foxing, with their album, Nearer My God, and let me check out this other album title, Draw Down the Moon, fantastic albums. And then, let me do one more shout out if I can think of it. Oh, I've lately gotten into the Wonder Years pretty hardcore. It was thanks to going to a concert that they had for their anniversary tour of their first couple albums. Suburbia, I've Given You Everything and Now I'm Nothing, and the one before that, the Upsiders, I think that's the name of it. And then I saw them perform. Inadvertently, I was there to see Spanish Love Songs, which is another quintessential Ryan Kearns band. There's so many quintessential Ryan Kearns bands.
I know, I was about to say.
I should make a playlist called Ryan Kearns. But yeah, I think that encapsulates where I'm at, where I've been, and I have no idea where I'm going, man. I'm just here for the ride.
No, I think we've pretty much encapsulated where we both are right now, with one glaring omission that we could save for a future show, and that is jazz. We really haven't talked a whole lot about jazz.
Oh, yeah. We'll save that for a future show. But yeah, do you have anything else to add? Not
really. I think we pretty much gave proper introductions, or an introduction if nothing else.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what the next episode is going to be. That's going to be an episode choosing of since I basically kind of chose the first two episodes, I want to leave the table open for Matt.
Okay. All right. Yeah, well, I'll think of something, and whatever it is, I'm sure you'll hear about it in the next episode. So
yeah. So that being said, I know we didn't end the last episode. I almost said last week's pod, but these podcasts are being recorded basically within the same week. So breaking down the fourth wall right now. But I'm sure we're gonna have to have a tagline like this. So depending on your podcasting platform of choice, make sure that you give this podcast a 5-star review on Spotify and iTunes. It feels so weird to say that,
it does, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it really does.
And then I know that we don't, as of this podcast recording, we don't have any social medias or Patreons set up.
Right.
It might be not until maybe the 10th episode where we can really get this going that we get a Patreon set up, because let's face it, let's get some followers first before we start asking people for money.
Yeah.
But yeah, main thing is just make sure that you share this with everybody that you would really feel that would really enjoy this stuff. Give us a 5-star review on all the podcasting platforms of choice, because that really helps the podcast grow. But yeah, that's all that I got. Do you have anything else to add, Mr. Matthew?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. We don't have a P.O. box yet. We don't have a...
So yeah. So you want to send us out, Matt?
Sure. Thank you for listening to episode 2 of Hey, Listen to This. And again, if you liked it, share it with your friends. Share it with your favorite algorithms of choice. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Take care, everyone.